While Hitler may have borne the empire no ill will, this was not true of Germany's allies. Italy coveted British territory in Africa, and Japan sought the dismemberment of British rule in the Far East. As American ships burnt at Pearl Harbor, the Japanese unleashed a wave of invasion, taking Malaya, taking New Guinea and Borneo, besieging and capturing Hong Kong, and bombing northern Australia. If there was one single event of the war that was a blow to the very core of the British Empire, it was Japan's capture of Singapore in 1942. Between the wars, the money for a huge state-of-the-art naval base had been scraped together by an impoverished British Empire. The result was a naval fortress that was both a symbolic and actual proof of national strength and security. Australia and New Zealand saw a British fleet at Singapore as the guarantee of their protection. Singapore was indeed a handsome imperial city and commercial centre, a place where Europeans abroad could live good lives whilst earning fortunes. In January 1942, the mighty fortress stood effectively empty, quietly abandoned. The battleships, which should have lain at anchor, were fighting in the Mediterranean defending Egypt. The fighters, which should have lined Singapore's airfields, were shooting down bombers in the skies of southern England. There were no modern weapons anywhere. In January 1942, Japanese armies swept southwards, down the Malay Peninsula towards Singapore. 2 British battleships were sunk by Japanese aircraft. The Grand British Plan had always imagined Singapore attacked from the sea by a navy of another European power, not from the land by an army of Asian people. Famously, all the big guns pointed out to sea. On the 15th of February, the Japanese laid siege to Singapore, and the forces of the British Empire were compelled to surrender. As nearly 150,000 marched into captivity, 200 years of imperial history were destroyed. Asians never looked at the British in the same way again. The British Navy had failed. The British Army had been outfought. White men had panicked and surrendered to an army of Asians. The Japanese continued their advance, invading Burma, fighting on the very borders of India. The Japanese brought a message of liberation to the native peoples of the British Empire. Many of the Indian troops captured by Japan went over to the Japanese side to fight as the Indian National Army for Indian independence. With the Japanese battering at the gates of India, Gandhi chose to reopen his demands for the British to leave, and inspired a wave of protests and strikes. It showed a capricious, cynical, and opportunistic streak in the great soul. The British regarded it as near treason. A fascinating what-if is to imagine how events would have turned out had Japan liberated India. There would have been no fair trial for any Congress leader who opposed a Japanese governor. In other former European colonies, the Japanese introduced a regime that was harsh and exploitative. The British wrongly saw their imperial subjects as children needing guidance, but the Japanese imperialist saw those same people as subhuman, barely above animals. The British government dispatched a cabinet minister, Stafford Cripps, to India to negotiate a settlement. Cripps, a socialist sympathetic to Congress, met with Nehru, Jinnah, Gandhi, and all the other representatives of Indian nationalism. Cripps offered what Indians had demanded after World War I, dominion status, the equal of Australia or Canada in the family of the empire, if the protests ceased and the Congress Party backed the war effort. He was rebuffed. The British were to crack down on opposition, and for the last time, Gandhi found himself in a British jail. Many thousands of Indian soldiers took part in the fighting that eventually beat back the Japanese and brought victory over the forces of dictatorship all over the world. They fought with bravery, honor, and distinction, as did troops from all over the empire. America and Russia emerged from the war strengthened as the two superpowers that would dominate the world in the coming decades. Britain emerged from the war weakened, bankrupt, and industrially destroyed. The USA was, in its very act of creation, a rejection of the British Empire, having fought a war of independence. Early in World War II, Britain and America signed a declaration of common war aims, the Atlantic Charter. Churchill traveled to meet American President Roosevelt in grand imperial style on a battleship of the Royal Navy, beneath the mighty guns of which the Charter was signed before the cameras of the world. One clause of the Charter declared the right of all peoples to choose the form of government under which they live. Churchill, the die-hard imperialist, argued, reasoned, blustered, raged, and in the end pleaded with Roosevelt that this clause should exclude the British Empire. The American was immovable. When the leaders of the great powers sat around the conference tables of strategy, the Americans were always at their most suspicious and their least sympathetic when they saw a hidden British agenda to save the empire rather than defeat fascism. America did not believe its young men fought and died in the Solomon Islands to see the British simply reclaim their Pacific Island colonies. America was privately furious that Hong Kong's governor, on his liberation by Americans, quickly ran up the Union Jack, restoring the status quo in the British colony. America looked to a new world order and saw the goal as saving China from communism. Soviet Russia, by definition, saw imperialism as the highest expression of capitalism. The Russian Tsar had been deposed and killed, and yet the USSR inherited the Tsar's ambitions to interfere and meddle with British rule in India. And so this superpower, like the Americans, saw no reason to support the British Empire. In 1945, America became the preeminent power in the post-war world. American approval was needed for any policy that Britain might wish to pursue. American economic strength meant America bankrolled Britain, and hence the empire. America had resented the empire's pre-war attempts to sabotage free trade with imperial protection and demanded access to the vast markets that the empire offered. When the war ended, a strong U.S. economy stepped into the place of a worn-out Britain and supplied even more goods that Britain could not. Wherever in the world the Americans went, they always stood out in contrast to the British. They made the empire look stuffy, old-fashioned, pompous and weak. The world could see that America plotted the path to the future. The rainy streets of London witnessed the last true march of the empire, in the victory parade of World War II. There would be other marches, but they would be sham, theatrical nostalgia. As soldiers from all over the world marched past the King Emperor that day, the forces of history that had been slowly gathering for most of the 20th century were about to burst upon the empire and change the lives of all her people, both great and small. Within the lifetime of most present, even the aged Churchill, then aged 70, the empire would come to live only in memory.